Let's go.
All right. Welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm authentically EJ.
And I'm Stacy the linguist. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, and today we're going to talk about orthography, otherwise known
Orthography.
as writing.
All those little squiggles on the page that you see every day.
Right? All the squiggles on the page that carry so much meaning and information. So, I want to start off by just making like a really, really clear distinction when it comes
Yes.
to linguistics. Like, writing is not language. Like, writing is not
Yes.
the source of truth when it comes to language. Writing is just a system that people have created to try to record language, but it's not actually the source of truth when it comes to language.
Yes. All of those writing rules, I before E except after C, when to use semicolons, those are all standardizations, right? Because we decided at some point in human history that, hey, it might be useful if we like write language down so I don't just have to remember the thing that Razvan over there said a while ago. If I write it down, then I can remember it for longer because then I can just look at what he said rather than having to remember like the exact words that he used, right? Like at some point we decided that that was a good way to do it, but in order for that to work on like a large scale, we had to standardize a lot of things, add like some rules to make sure that we were all on the same page about stuff. So
Mm.
writing is a very different process from language itself. They're very interconnected, but they are separate.
Well, and because of that, so let's first, there's multiple ways of like multiple types of writing systems. So you
Mm-hmm.
have like the alphabet, where theoretically each letter, each symbol correlates to a sound in
Mm-hmm.
theory. And then you have, syllabaries where like a symbol might represent a syllable, or
Mm-hmm.
you have like logographic systems like characters where something might be more symbolic, more of a picture, but then even in those cases they end up also eventually correlating to symbols and sounds. And so there's a lot of interesting things that go on. But even if you're looking at the most basic level of like the alphabet, one symbol for one sound, that's never going to actually correlate with how people speak. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason why is like if you take English and we've standardized it so that, we use dictionaries and everybody writes the same word the same way because that makes it a lot easier to understand what people are writing and to be able to
Mm-hmm.
read stuff. Well, then what happened to your dialects? Like people all across the US and the UK and South Africa and Australia are saying these words in very different ways, and we're not accounting for that in our writing system. And so that's why I say, like, if you want to study language, you can look at some interesting stuff with writing, but you really need the spoken language to understand how people are actually using it.
Exactly. And to kind of piggyback off of that, writing lasts for a long time, right? That's probably why we came up with it in the first place, right? So we could have a record of what was said. But with that comes like language changes over time, but because writing stays somewhat stagnant, you do get some weird shit that happens in writing systems where you pronounce something differently in your spoken word, but it's written in such a funky way. Like I just saw like a TikTok about a kid learning how to read could, would, and should. And it's like, we don't say the L's in there, but the L's are in there and they were there for a reason. And they probably had a reason in the past, but we don't use them anymore. And so there is like a difference between like the spelling and the pronunciation. And that's mostly because like language changes, but standardizations of language like writing are a lot slower to change, if at all. And
Definitely.
sometimes it's easier to just keep things the way that they are so we can have these like long-term documents that we can understand, rather than trying to constantly update it.
Mm.
But that's something that I think a lot of common people, I say common people, but just like, your everyday person is like, why the fuck is there an L in could? We don't say the L. And they get like all knotted up about this. And they think like, that's the big problem with language right now. And it's like, nah, that's a separate problem.
Right. Well, and it's a really interesting thing because like as linguists, we usually like to be descriptivists instead of prescriptivists, but especially when it comes to writing, there are so many advantages to that standardization and being able to communicate more widely because of it. And like standardization is prescriptive. And so we do end up with this interesting dichotomy where when you're being taught to write, you are taught very, very prescriptively. And so writing also tends to like vary a bit in style from the way that people actually speak because of the very prescriptive method that we're taught it and the way that people are taught to be more formal and adhere more closely to grammatical rules. And so again, writing doesn't actually match, more natural language.
Yeah. And I actually had this conversation with a friend a couple months back. She wants to design like a language learning app and was like, I really, really, really want to use the International Phonetic Alphabet in this app. And was like, that is something that is something that I think is so good. Everybody should use the International Phonetic Alphabet. That's the alphabet that that linguists use, that like phonologists use, to transcribe speech. And it's more accurate. It's not perfect, but it's more accurate than a lot of like your standard alphabets, the Latin alphabet.
Because you're trying to capture the actual sounds in a systematic way across languages rather than using a single language's phonemes. Like each language has different sounds that matter to them. And so if you're only using one language's alphabet, you're only getting a very narrow set of sounds. Versus in another language, like a single sound in one language might be split up into 5 sounds in another language. And so you'd need a different alphabet. And the phonetic alphabet tries to be descriptive and, account for variations across language.
Again, it tries. It's not perfect. It's very hard to do things like this. But anyway, she was like insistent. She was like, I want to have the IPA included in the app. And I had to kind of sit her down and say, all right, look, the IPA is fantastic. Like as linguists, as teachers, it's a wonderful tool that we can use. But if you're looking to make things accessible for people, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. People
don't think about what they're actually saying. People aren't usually cognizant of the sounds they're making.
Exactly. It's for a very different purpose. The IPA is not meant to be like a universal writing system. That's absolutely not its job. Like it's meant to capture, it's meant specifically like for people who are working with sounds to be able to like capture the sounds rather than compact meaning in a nice happy little written chunk, right? They're two very different systems. And so I wanted to tell that story partially to kind of introduce the IPA is like, hey, you can use alphabets in a specific way. There are like very descriptive ways of writing, but it's not always very effective to have a purely phonetic alphabet. And not only like to change everything to a purely phonetic alphabet would be very expensive and very hard.
So there have actually been efforts to do that, though.
I'm sure, but like in reality, that's like the IPA, like we said, it's a tool for a different problem. It's not necessarily built to handle your everyday activities, right? Like reading a billboard on the street or enjoying a story that was written by somebody, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not. I do want to bring up a couple of cases though when people have tried to make their writing systems more phonetic, especially in cultures with language associations that we've talked about a little bit in the past. They might try to systematize their writing systems. And like Finnish is a good example of a language that's actually pretty phonetic as far as the writing system goes.
It's considered the most phonetic writing system aside from the IPA.
Yeah. And then you have, I mean, Spanish is going to be more phonetic than English just based on the writing, the history of the writing system. But still, like
Hmm.
if you talk with someone from Puerto Rico, they're not going to be saying a lot of the S's that you're seeing in the written language. So, like, it's
Yeah.
still not actually phonetic. But one that I think is really fascinating, and this is kind of like local to where I am here in Utah. There was a leader in Utah who created an alphabet called the Deseret alphabet, and it was Brigham Young, who was, one of the leaders of the LDS Church, and one of the first leaders in Utah as a whole, from, obviously not including the Native Americans who were here first and always deserve more credit than they get. But Brigham Young was definitely one of those, primary leaders, and he created the Desert alphabet with the intent of having it be fully phonetic. And they actually published books in the Desert alphabet, and it totally failed. It did not take on, like, no one wants to learn a new writing system. The symbols that they used were, I think they were a little bit more swirly than like the Latin alphabet, for, lack of a better descriptor. You can look it up. It's definitely a fascinating experiment as far as writing goes, but it did not take on. And I think a lot of the reason why is because, if you just take English, we have all these like discrepancies that, Stacy was talking about. Like why aren't we saying the L in talk? Or, why are all these things spelled differently when they're said the same? A lot of the time you look at those words and maybe there's a noun and a verb that when spoken actually sound super different, but they're spelled basically the same, and it actually allows you to keep track of the meaning. Like there's a lot of advantages to using an alphabet that has carried through time, even if it isn't used perfectly phonetically. And
Hmm.
then that on top of the fact that everybody already used the Latin alphabet. So why are you going to go out of your way to learn a different one that there's no literature actually written in? Like there's a lot of reasons why it didn't take on.
Yeah. And like learning to read and write is hard and it's a skill. And so to just like flip that on people, especially adults, they're not likely to want to change. But additionally, the reason why purely phonetic alphabets, there's a bunch of reasons why purely phonetic alphabets work or do not work. But I kind of want to go back to what you were originally saying, EJ, about how the fact that you can have like syllable based orthographies and
Mhm.
character based orthographies. And those orthographies are just as effective as an alphabet.
Yeah.
Like in terms of utility, they do the same job. And
Hmm.
that's really what matters. So having like an alphabet or having characters is not like I mean, of course there's advantages and disadvantages in terms of like writing it or like, putting it on like into technology, but that's more of just like how we've developed those things.
Yeah.
More than anything, it's not necessarily reflective of how good or bad they are. Again, it's
Hmm.
just a different type of tool. But like character based orthography has been around for centuries
Oh yeah,
centuries and has been a very very effective form of communication for many different groups of people. And so
definitely.
like orthographies come in many different flavors, and character based flavors are just as valid and important as alphabets, even though an alphabet has a slight advantage about being more phonetic. Consider that a character based alphabet can kind of be more symbolic in certain ways and can kind of work with your more semantic properties instead of your purely phonological properties.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, let's talk about a couple of examples of these. So I think
Yeah.
the one of the ones that comes to mind is Chinese.
Yep.
And like the fact that Chinese uses characters, uses a more symbolic system, is part of what leads into the same character system being able to be used across Cantonese, Mandarin, and different dialects of Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
So that's super interesting. And like, yes, there are going to be variations in how they use that writing system that develop
Mm-hmm.
over time. It's definitely not
Mm-hmm.
going to be perfect, but it has led to that. And then there are characters that because you know the different pieces that make up this character, you can deduce the meaning maybe occasionally based on how it's constituted. And then there are also cases when a character will take on phonetic meaning as well. So you'll have cases in Chinese when, they'll have a character that has taken on a sound based on a meaning that was associated with it, and then it's going to also be applied to a word with a similar sound even though it has a different meaning. So you still
Mm-hmm.
do have phonological things happening with characters, even if it is more logographic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The way that, just as a fun fact to bring in a little bit of psycholinguistics here, it doesn't matter what alphabet you're using, it always gets processed phonologically. We This is just like a fun, interesting thing. No matter what kind of you use characters in logography or you use an alphabet, it always gets processed phonologically. That's just something that we've found. So it is very interesting to kind of like see how, even though there are so many different like writing systems and styles, ultimately they're getting processed like the same way that we process spoken language.
Yeah. I want to bring up one other example because I think this is like one of those really cliche things that people teach that's not actually true.
Let's go for it. Let's debunk some myths.
Yeah, so ancient Egyptian. This is like
Yes.
the classic example of a symbolic writing system, right? Like everyone's learned in school that they used symbols that represented things, and that's how ancient Egyptian works. And yeah, but no. So I've actually been to Egypt a couple times because my family lived there after I graduated high school. And I read a couple books on ancient Egyptian, like specifically the writing system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating because, yes, there are definitely some very pictographic, aspects to it. It definitely looks more like pictures than, any other alphabet that I have seen or any
Mm-hmm.
other writing system. And so
Yeah.
there definitely are things where, like, you have something that looks like a bird and it might be representing a bird, or you have something that looks like a key and it might be representing a key. But it's actually the symbols that you have in ancient Egyptian correlate to sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting because some of them will correlate to one sound,
Mm-hmm.
the same way in like the Latin alphabet, and then some of them might correlate to two or three sounds put together. So you might have like an ah, an an, and an ankh. Like those might be three separate characters for those three separate sound. And you in ancient Egyptian, they can actually put those together to fill the right amount of space that they wanted to on a stone. So if you wanted to say like ankh, you might be able to do that with one syllable, with one symbol, but you might put in the symbol for ankh, and you might put in the symbol for an, and you might put in the symbol for ah, and like string those together because you want to fill in more space. And so there's some really interesting things about the ancient Egyptian writing system. It could also be written in multiple directions, and they would change the direction that like a bird's and other symbols were facing to indicate the writing direction.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese is one that can also be written in multiple directions, but the symbols themselves don't change if you're writing them, left to right or top down kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, there are Egyptologists out there who spend their entire lives looking at this writing system
Right.
because it's
Yeah,
so fascinating.
I still know very, very little about it, but I thought that, the couple books that I did read on it were super, super fascinating.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's absolutely mind-boggling. To bring in a little bit more of a like linguistic side to a bit of our chat. The directionality in which you read is really interesting and really like fascinating. Like so you mentioned like bidirectionality and stuff. When somebody is like designing a psycholinguistic experiment, like in our previous episode we had talked a little bit about eye tracking, you have to keep in mind how, like, what people's primary languages and what their and how the orthography reads, because that can influence how their gaze moves across a screen.
Mm,
So in English we read left to right, and so our gaze naturally follows from left to right. If you were to look at somebody who reads an Arabic script, you would find the reverse. It would be from right to left. And if you found someone and if you were doing something in Chinese, well, it's gonna vary, but I believe they have more of a top down.
they can do top down, yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of the
I,
time they will do left right, but top down
yeah,
is it definitely exists.
top down definitely exists, and so that's something that you have to take into account when you're doing like psycholinguistic studies, because when people are because your writing system can kind of like, it's like a bias as to how
Mm,
you approach like a new situation linguistically speaking.
yeah. And I think I did misspeak. Like they would actually prefer right to left over left to right most times. But
There you go.
yeah, it's still
Yeah.
like they can do top down for sure.
Yes.
It is super, super fascinating.
Yeah. It is really interesting because like writing is what's also interesting is that writing and reading are like innate cognitive processes as well.
Mm.
Like once you learn it, you cannot unlearn it. Like you cannot teach yourself not to read.
Well, and when you're reading, like at first you're sounding out the words, but then once
Uh-huh.
people actually know how to read, they're not doing that anymore. They're just like glancing over the entire word to get the meaning.
Yeah. And this there've been like a bunch of studies done on kind of like the in how connected orthography is to language.
Mm,
And ultimately what it is that we are, processing everything phonologically and then just kind of using the writing as like a touch base of like, okay, once I see this, then I can just fill in the blanks myself.
mm,
And so when we're reading, it's such an automatic process because we're using the same kind of process as if someone were speaking to us.
yeah,
If you're standing next to somebody and they're talking on the phone, you can't help but comprehend what they're saying if you're speaking the same language, right? It's just an
definitely.
automatic process. And because writing uses that same kind of process, you can't help but read whatever it is that's written. It's
Definitely.
absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Maybe a couple other fun things about alphabets. Like when you're talking about directionality, Arabic
Yeah.
has an interesting thing where words are written right to left, but numbers are written left to right, which is super fascinating, in my opinion, an interesting convention.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also have alphabets, and there is a technical name for this that's not coming to mind at the moment, but there's alphabets that exclude vowels. So I think
Yeah.
Hebrew is an example of one that is usually just the consonants are represented, and you just have to know what vowels would be there. Or Arabic will generally have some kind of diacritic, some kind of like, little symbols around the consonants, which I believe are optional, but to
Yeah.
indicate the vowels.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Which kind of contrasts to spoken language.
Oh yeah.
Where spoken language, we focus way more on the vowels than we do on the consonants because vowels are louder. You resonate more with vowels when you speak. And so when we listen, we're not necessarily looking for those exact T's or K's or S's or whatever. We can kind of glance over those. We're more focused on the vowels. So it's kind of fascinating that like in orthography, you can essentially leave out the vowels and people will still understand what you're saying. But again, I think that might have something to do with like the consonants like coloring the vowels rather than like the vowels being, well, the vowels aren't necessary. Every language has vowels. Every single language has vowels. But yeah, so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. And like I like how you're saying every language has vowels because that seems like a really, really obvious statement. But when you actually think about the phonetic difference between a consonant and a vowel, like a vowel is just when your mouth is more open, right? Like your tongue is somewhere in your mouth that's influencing what vowel you're actually saying, but it's not a stop, it's not a fricative where you're like holding your tongue against another part of your mouth and like actually like more blocking the sound. Like the vowel is the more open sound. And of course, like biologically, you know, when you're making sound, you're going to have open sounds, you're going to have more closed sounds. And so it is like a natural property of language.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And like it's what helps us be understood, right? If
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about like phonetic economy, we would just be screaming all the time
Mm.
because that's the most resonant thing. We wouldn't because
You
in
don't
terms of
scream consonants, you scream
you
vowels.
scream vowels, you scream vowels. So in terms of economy, you either wouldn't speak at all, or you would just speak in just like ah, right? But we need to encode way more meaning than just yo. And so we have consonants to kind of flavor things a little bit and to add those contrasts so we can kind of distinguish between all of these beautiful vowels that mix together. We
Definitely.
got off on a little bit of a sidetrack, but it is
We did.
like
It's good.
it's good. It's fine. But back to orthography. It is kind of interesting how you can kind of like leave out vowels, and even I would say even in like Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet is the one that we use here in English, and a lot of other Western cultures do, like Spanish and French. They all use the Latin alphabet in their writing systems. You can even leave out letters in a lot of our words, and we just fill in the blanks.
Mm-hmm.
There's a like I'm sure there's plenty of things on the internet that where you can like test
Mix word
how,
order and or mix
yeah, you
letter
can
order within
change
a word
letter
and stuff.
order, you can remove letters, you can add in new letters, and we still get like we're still super good at getting the right word every time.
Yeah, those are super fascinating.
Humans have become really, really good at reading
Yeah.
and processing language visually.
Mm-hmm. One thing I will say, also is that writing does end up influencing language and
Yes.
influencing speaking. I mean, I think all
Yes.
of us have had that awkward moment when you've only ever read something and you try and say it and you just say it the way it's spelled and it's like
Yep.
totally wrong.
Yep.
So like that definitely happens, but then also like think of acronyms. Acronyms are just taking the first letter in the alphabet from a word, and a lot of people will actually say acronyms out loud now, like lol or rip, you know?
Or ASAP or AWOL.
Exactly. And those have become part of our just lexicon, I think, because of the writing system that we're using and being able to, you know, abbreviate, truncate things in different ways.
Yeah. And I will say that there are specific linguists out there who make it their job in their lives to look at how writing has influenced language and vice versa. Because writing has been around for so long that it is, even though it is a separate process from language, it is still connected in such like a deep way, that
Mhm.
it's sometimes it's hard to pull apart, where language influencing writing and writing influencing language begins and ends. It's hard to say.
Definitely. Cool. Well, do you have any other last thoughts on orthography?
Yeah, I guess my last thing would just be like a lot of most questions out there. I get a lot of questions about orthography, about why is something spelled this way, and most linguists don't know why something is spelled a certain way. This is just like a PSA, is that like etymology is a very different study from linguistics, and those two things have two very different groups of people working behind them.
Yeah, and a lot of the time it will be like a historical linguistics thing,
Yeah.
or it will be like a borrowed word from another language. Like
Mm-hmm.
there is a pretty good set of reasons for that. But yeah, if you just Google the word that you're thinking about and etymology or history of the word, then you should be able to track that down because, you know,
Yeah.
the internet is amazing and so many people have done great work
Oh
cataloging and
yeah.
writing
And
all this stuff
you
down.
may get folk etymologies, and we can just briefly mention those of oh, I think this is a word because of X, Y, and Z, or like how it's related. That might not be the true etymology. So just be aware that folk etymologies exist, because when people are like learning a new language, you'll do anything you can to kind of like get your brain to remember something, including coming up with how that word might be connected to other words that are similar to it, but that maybe that's not actually how it's done. So just be aware that folk etymologies exist, but real etymologies actually exist, and there's lots of people working on that. And I appreciate those people so much, because I know that if people ask me that question, I can pass it off to etymologists, and they do such a good job at answering the questions.
Yeah, definitely. Those are great call outs. Awesome. Well, that is kind of a broad view of orthography, writing systems. Do let us know if there's anything that you would love to have us chat about, or if there's anything you have questions about. We would love to hear it. And follow us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. See you
We
next
will
time.
be there, and we will be engaging with you. Come say hi on Instagram. See y'all later.